The bus station was alive with the hustle and bustle of commuters, but Karen's focus was zeroed in on one suspicious man. An unsettling feeling gnawed at her, urging her to take action. With her phone clutched tightly, 911 ready on speed dial, she felt a mix of determination and dread. As the seconds ticked by, she wondered, what could possibly go wrong? Stay tuned to find out how her instincts lead her into a gripping encounter. The sun hung lazily in the sky, casting a warm glow over the bustling city. It was a typical afternoon at Union Station, where commuters hurried from one platform to another, checking their watches, scrolling through their phones, or searching the ever-changing arrival and departure boards. The station hummed with a chaotic rhythm, blending the sounds of announcements, conversations, and footsteps into a familiar symphony of urban life. Amid the crowd, James Carter stood quietly near the corner of the bus terminal, his back against the weathered bench as he observed the activity around him. James was tall, with a calm yet confident demeanor that made him stand out, even in his casual attire of a simple dark jacket and jeans. His sharp eyes, trained from years of working in law enforcement, scanned the crowd with practiced ease, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. He'd been waiting for his bus for about 20 minutes, and his mind wandered between his upcoming work assignments and his plans for the weekend. Little did he know, his uneventful wait was about to take a sharp and unexpected turn. Across the station, Karen Simmons clutched her purse tightly as she waited on a nearby bench. Karen, in her mid-40s, had a pinched expression, her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been feeling uneasy ever since she arrived at the station. Crowds made her nervous, and her eyes darted around, jumping from person to person as if scanning for danger. Her unease deepened when her gaze landed on James. To Karen, James didn't look like the typical commuters she was used to seeing at Union Station. There was something about him, his stillness, his presence, the way he seemed to be looking around, that made her uncomfortable. Her stomach twisted with an irrational fear that she couldn't shake. In Karen's mind, something wasn't right about him. Was he waiting for someone? Was he up to something? Her thoughts spiraled as she observed him from across the terminal. Suddenly, her phone buzzed in her lap, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced down to see a message from her friend asking about their dinner plans for the evening, but she ignored it, her focus snapping back to James. He was still there, leaning casually against the bench, his hands in his jacket pockets, his eyes sweeping over the station. To Karen, he looked too calm, too observant. The way he stood there, relaxed yet alert, made her feel more uneasy. She convinced herself that something was off, that there was no way he could just be waiting for a bus like everyone else. After another few minutes of watching him, her anxiety peaked. She didn't know what it was about him, his height, his calmness, the fact that he wasn't glued to his phone like everyone else, but it gnawed at her. He's too suspicious, she whispered to herself, her fingers tapping nervously against the armrest of the bench. Karen's heart raced as her fear morphed into a misguided sense of responsibility. She had heard enough stories in the news, and in her mind, it was better to be safe than sorry. She told herself that she was doing the right thing, that she was protecting everyone at the station. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. With a deep breath, Karen unlocked her phone and dialed 911. Her voice shook as she tried to keep her tone calm but urgent. "Yes, I'm at Union Station," she said, glancing nervously at James as she spoke. "There's a man here. I don't know, he's acting strange. I think he might be up to something. He's been standing here for a while, just watching people. I'm worried." The dispatcher's voice on the other end asked her to describe the man. Karen hesitated for a moment, looking James up and down from her distance. He's tall, black, wearing a dark jacket. "I don't know what he's planning, but I have a bad feeling about this. Could you send someone over?" As Karen hung up the phone, her chest tightened with a mixture of fear and self-righteousness. She had done it. She had taken action. Now, she just had to wait. She felt a rush of adrenaline, as if she had just saved the day. James, meanwhile, continued to wait, unaware of the phone call that had just been made about him. He checked his watch, glancing at the bus schedule posted on a nearby pillar. His bus was still 10 minutes away. He shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket. The station was unusually crowded today, and he found himself tuning into the fragments of conversations around him, the sounds of footsteps rushing past, and the occasional honk from a nearby street. Loving the story so far? Click that like button and subscribe to stay updated on our latest videos. We appreciate all your support. Share in the comments where you're watching from, and let's continue the adventure. It wasn't until the flashing lights of two approaching police cars caught his attention that James sensed something was off. He stood up straighter, watching as the officers stepped out of their vehicles and began making their way through the station. His training kicked in, and his instincts told him that this was more than just a routine check. He could see the intensity in their eyes, the way they scanned the area with purpose. They were looking for someone. His eyes briefly flickered to the woman he had noticed earlier, Karen, who was now frantically waving at the officers, pointing in his direction. James furrowed his brow. What's going on? He wondered silently. The officers, now fully aware of Karen's direction, approached James with cautious authority. Sir, can you come with us for a moment? One of them said, his voice steady but firm. James was no stranger to law enforcement procedures, but this caught him off guard. He raised his hands slightly in a non-threatening gesture. Sure, officer, he replied, his voice calm. What seems to be the problem? Someone called in about suspicious behavior. We just need to ask you a few questions and see some identification, the officer responded, his tone neutral but guarded. James nodded, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. His movements were smooth, deliberate. He knew exactly how to handle himself in situations like these. I've got my ID right here, he said, pulling out his wallet. The officers tensed for a brief moment as James retrieved his ID, but their expressions shifted dramatically the moment they saw what was inside. In a split second, everything changed. Karen, standing a few feet away, craned her neck to see what was happening. Her heart pounded in her chest, anticipation and fear swirling within her. She was certain that she had done the right thing. After all, she had saved everyone from whatever it was that man was planning. Right? But as the officers glanced at James's ID, their entire demeanor shifted from suspicion to respect. One of them stepped back, his posture relaxing, while the other cleared his throat. Sir, we're sorry for the inconvenience. We didn't realize. James handed them his ID and badge. He was an FBI agent. Karen watched, her breath catching in her throat, as the officer's expressions changed in an instant. Just moments ago, she had felt a surge of self-righteousness, convinced she was doing her civic duty by reporting the man who had made her feel uneasy. But now, something was wrong. The officers who had approached James with such authority were stepping back. Their shoulders, once tense, had visibly relaxed. One of them even gave a polite nod. This wasn't what Karen expected. The officers handed back James's identification, clearly impressed. Apologies, sir, said the first officer, his tone now much more respectful. We didn't know you were with the Bureau. Karen blinked, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. The Bureau? What Bureau? She strained to hear more, trying to make sense of the unfolding situation, but the officers' voices had dropped to a quieter, almost reverent tone. James, still composed, accepted his badge and ID with a curt nod. His calm demeanor remained intact, but there was a subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't just a man waiting for a bus anymore. He was an FBI agent, someone whose job it was to maintain law and order, someone trained to handle situations far more complicated than this one. Karen's stomach twisted as the weight of the situation began to settle on her shoulders. An FBI agent. She had called the police on an FBI agent. Her mind raced. This wasn't what she had expected. In fact, this was the complete opposite of what she had imagined when she made that call. She had been so sure, so convinced that she was protecting herself and everyone else at the bus station. But now, it was clear that she had made a terrible mistake. The second officer, still speaking to James, explained the situation as politely as possible. "We received a report from a concerned citizen," he said, his eyes flickering briefly toward Karen. "We had to investigate, but clearly, there's no issue here." James's eyes followed the officer's gaze, landing on Karen. For the first time, he saw the woman who had made the call, the one who had waved the police over to him. Their eyes locked for a brief moment, and in that second, Karen felt an overwhelming sense of shame wash over her. She had been so quick to judge him, so quick to act on her assumptions, and now she was being exposed for it in the most humiliating way possible. James, however, didn't hold her gaze for long. He turned back to the officers, his voice steady and professional. "I understand you're just doing your job," he said, slipping his badge back into his jacket. "But I'm sure you know what this looks like." The officers shifted uncomfortably. They knew exactly what he meant. False reports like this weren't uncommon, and they had been trained to handle them with care. Yet, standing face to face with an FBI agent made it all the more serious. They could sense James's underlying frustration, even though he remained composed. "We apologize for the misunderstanding, sir," the first officer repeated. "Is there anything else we can do for you?" James shook his head. "No, that'll be all. I just hope in the future, we all think twice before jumping to conclusions." His words, though calm, carried a weight that hung heavily in the air. The officers gave a final nod before stepping back and heading toward their patrol cars. Karen, standing frozen in place, felt like the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her stomach churned with a mix of embarrassment, guilt, and fear. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had publicly humiliated herself, and worse, she had wrongfully accused someone based on nothing more than her own biased assumptions. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear into the crowd, but it was too late for that. People were watching. Some had been drawn to the commotion when the police cars had arrived, and now they were whispering among themselves. She could feel their eyes on her, judging her just as she had judged James. Her throat felt dry as panic crept in. James, now turning his attention back to the bus schedule, acted as if nothing had happened. He was used to this sort of thing, being treated with suspicion simply because of his appearance. It wasn't new, but it never stopped stinging. Today, though, was different. Today, it was a white woman calling the police on him at a bus station, but he had the shield of his FBI credentials to stop the situation from spiraling further. Not every black man in America had that luxury. Karen hesitated, not knowing what to do. Should she apologize? Should she say something? Her mind raced through scenarios, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Every fiber of her being wanted to flee the scene, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? A part of her had hoped the officers would be on her side, would support her assumptions, and validate the fear she had felt. Instead, they had treated James with the utmost respect and had left her standing there, exposed as the one who had acted on irrational fears. Suddenly, Karen felt a cold chill run down her spine as a few bystanders, who had been watching the scene unfold, began to murmur amongst themselves. A man to her right shook his head disapprovingly, his eyes narrowing at her. "Unbelievable," she heard him mutter to his companion. "Can't even wait for a bus without someone jumping to conclusions." Karen's face burned with embarrassment. She wanted to shout that she hadn't meant any harm, that she wasn't trying to be cruel. But no words came. All she had done was embarrass herself, and for what? The worst part was, she knew deep down that there hadn't been anything really suspicious about James from the beginning. She had simply acted on her unfounded fears. As the bus pulled up, James stepped toward the door, casually joining the line of other passengers. For him, this incident would be just another story to tell, another reminder of the bias he faced even as a federal agent. He had faced worse, and he knew that moments like this wouldn't stop him from continuing his work. But they did serve as constant reminders that no matter how high he climbed in his career, someone somewhere would always look at him and see a threat first. Karen, on the other hand, was left standing alone, the weight of her actions settling heavily on her shoulders. She watched as James boarded the bus, feeling like the world had just seen her at her worst. The judgmental eyes of the crowd around her felt unbearable. And as the bus pulled away, she was left to grapple with the realization of what she had done. In that moment, Karen was forced to confront something she had never truly faced before, her own biases and the damage they could cause, not just to others, but to herself. Karen stood frozen at the bus station, still grappling with the weight of what had just happened. The noise of the busy terminal felt distant now, as if the entire world had slowed down around her. The adrenaline that had fueled her initial actions was fading quickly, leaving behind a cold, sinking feeling in her chest. She was replaying the moments in her mind, her call to the police, the way the officers had approached James, and most vividly, the look on James's face when the truth was revealed. An FBI agent. She had called the police on an FBI agent. Karen's face flushed with humiliation, as she remembered the way the officers' demeanor had shifted the moment they saw James's credentials. 1 second, they were ready to treat him like a potential threat, just as she had wanted. The next, they were apologizing, showing him the respect that came with the badge he carried. And she was left standing there, exposed as the one who had jumped to conclusions. The crowd that had gathered during the commotion was slowly dispersing, but Karen could still feel their eyes on her. Some people had lingered, curious to see how the situation would play out. Others had recorded parts of the interaction on their phones. Karen's eyes darted nervously around the station, hoping against hope that no one had captured her on camera, but deep down she knew they had. The thought made her feel sick to her stomach. Just as she considered slipping away quietly, an elderly woman sitting on the bench near her spoke up. "You know, not everyone who looks different is a danger," the woman said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience and understanding. Her words were gentle, but they stung nonetheless. Karen wanted to defend herself, to say something, anything, that would justify her actions. But she couldn't. What could she possibly say? I thought, Karen stammered, but her voice trailed off. What had she thought? That James was a criminal, because he had been standing quietly, waiting for a bus like everyone else. She didn't even know how to finish her sentence because, in truth, she had acted on nothing more than her own prejudices. The elderly woman gave Karen a knowing look, her eyes filled with a mix of disappointment and sympathy. "We all make mistakes, dear. It's what you do afterward that matters." Karen swallowed hard, but the lump in her throat refused to go away. She felt like a child who had been caught doing something wrong and didn't know how to fix it. The woman's words rang in her ears, but Karen wasn't sure what to do with them. What you do afterward that matters. The problem was, she didn't know what to do now. Across the station, the bus James had boarded was pulling away from the curb. As it disappeared down the street, Karen's mind continued to race. Part of her wanted to run after it, to apologize to James and explain herself. Maybe he would understand. Maybe he would see that she wasn't a bad person, just misguided. But what would she even say? Would he even want to hear it? Karen remained rooted to the spot, feeling utterly exposed in a way she had never felt before. It wasn't just the embarrassment that weighed her down, it was the realization that she had hurt someone, possibly in ways she hadn't fully understood yet. James, meanwhile, sat near the back of the bus, gazing out the window as the city blurred past him. He had been in this situation before, more times than he cared to count. People who saw him and assumed the worst, just because of the color of his skin. It had been happening to him since he was a teenager, and now, even as a highly respected FBI agent, it still happened. This time, though, felt different. Maybe it was because he had his badge to defuse the situation before it escalated, or maybe it was because of the look on Karen's face when she realized she had been wrong. The shock, the confusion, the dawning horror. He could tell she hadn't expected this outcome. But that didn't make it better. If anything, it made it worse. James leaned back in his seat, his mind drifting to his younger days, long before the FBI. He thought about the many times people had looked at him the way Karen had, like he didn't belong, like he was a danger simply for existing in the same space as them. He remembered the first time a store clerk had followed him around a shop, assuming he was going to steal something. He remembered the first time he had been stopped by the police for fitting the description. Those moments had stayed with him, shaping how he moved through the world. But this time was different. Now, he had the authority of his badge to shield him. He could use it to stop situations like this from getting out of control, but it didn't erase the frustration that came with it. The bus hit a bump, pulling James out of his thoughts. He sighed and ran a hand over his face. The truth was, today's encounter had left him more tired than angry. He wasn't sure if it was because of his years in the FBI, or just life experience, but his reaction to these kinds of incidents had shifted over time. Anger had given way to a sort of weary acceptance, like he knew this would never really stop, no matter how many badges he carried, or how high he climbed in his career. There would always be someone like Karen, seeing him as a threat instead of a person. But as the bus rumbled on, James found himself thinking about what to do next. He had a choice. He could let this incident be another frustrating, exhausting reminder of the biases that still ran deep in society. Or he could use it as an opportunity to educate, to make people like Karen and the officers, and everyone who had watched, understand the consequences of their assumptions. He had spent years serving his country, but maybe it was time to take on a new mission, making sure incidents like this happened less and less. Back at the station, Karen remained seated on the bench, her mind swirling with shame, guilt, and confusion. She replayed the day's events in her head over and over, trying to pinpoint where everything had gone wrong. The reality was, it had gone wrong the moment she had decided to make that call. As the station began to empty out, the elderly woman who had spoken to her earlier stood up and gave Karen one last look before walking away. "Think about it," she said, her voice soft but firm. Karen watched her go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and dread. She knew she had to think about it, really think about it. For the first time in her life, she was forced to confront her own prejudices, to face the uncomfortable truth that she had been the problem today. She glanced at her phone, where she had called 911 not an hour ago. She had dialed so quickly, so sure of herself, so sure that she was in the right. Now, looking at the screen, she felt nauseous. She had done this. She had been the one who caused all of this. And for what? The weight of it all was too much. Karen stood up, pulling her purse over her shoulder, and began walking toward the exit. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew she couldn't run from what had just happened. Not anymore. Karen's walk back home from the bus station felt like the longest journey of her life. With each step, the reality of what she had done sank deeper into her conscience. She tried to distract herself by watching the cars pass by, the people crossing streets, but nothing could quiet the nagging voice in her head. The shame was overwhelming. She had acted on an impulse, a fear she couldn't explain, but had allowed to consume her. It was as if the past hour had revealed a version of herself she didn't want to believe existed. She had always thought of herself as a good person, kind, polite, and never someone to cause harm. But today, she had been the cause of harm, whether she wanted to admit it or not. When Karen finally reached her small, suburban house, she collapsed onto her couch, still unable to fully process the day. The TV droned on in the background, but she barely heard it. Her mind was replaying every second of the bus station incident on an endless loop. What had made her call the police? What had she been so afraid of? She couldn't even explain it to herself. The memories from earlier that day, the frantic call, the moment when the officers approached James, and the look on their faces when they saw his FBI credentials, haunted her. She kept seeing that moment when the officers had apologized to James, realizing he wasn't a suspect, but an agent of the law. And then, most vividly, she remembered how James had looked at her. Not with anger, but with disappointment, as if he'd seen her type too many times before. It was that look that made Karen feel small. It was a mirror showing her the worst of herself. In her own defense, she told herself that she hadn't meant to cause any real harm. She had just been nervous, she reasoned. But then another thought struck her. If James hadn't been an FBI agent, if he had been just another black man at the bus station, what would have happened? She knew, deep down, that the situation could have gone very differently. The police might have treated him like a suspect, arrested him, maybe even worse, all because of her call. Her stomach churned with guilt. The next day, Karen avoided the news, hoping to push the whole incident out of her mind. But that hope was shattered when she opened her social media feed. A video of the event had surfaced, captured by a bystander at the bus station. The footage showed everything: the police cars arriving, Karen pointing toward James, the officers questioning him, and finally the moment they saw his FBI badge. The caption underneath the video read, "Woman calls cops on innocent man, turns out he's an FBI agent." Karen's heart sank. The video had already gone viral. Comments were flooding in beneath the post. Some people were mocking her, calling her a Karen, a term that had become synonymous with racial profiling and white privilege. Others were much harsher, accusing her of blatant racism, of putting an innocent man's life in danger just because of her unfounded fears. She scrolled through the comments, her heart racing as she read the harsh words. Typical. She saw a black man and panicked. People like her are the reason so many innocent men get hurt, or worse. Imagine calling the cops on someone just because they don't look like you. Karen's chest tightened. Each comment felt like a blow, like the entire world had turned on her. And in some ways, it had. She had always been careful to present herself as a reasonable, level-headed person. But now, she had been reduced to a stereotype. She had become that person, the one people used as an example of ignorance and prejudice. As the day wore on, Karen's phone buzzed repeatedly. Friends and family members were reaching out, some with concern, others with confusion. Her sister left a voicemail, sounding both shocked and concerned. "Karen, I saw the video, what were you thinking? Call me back." But Karen couldn't bring herself to respond. She didn't want to explain, because she didn't have a good explanation. How could she tell them that she had acted purely on instinct, on fear, without ever questioning why she was so afraid? She knew it wasn't just the embarrassment that bothered her, it was the deeper realization that she had to confront her own biases. James, meanwhile, had returned to his office at the FBI. He sat at his desk, trying to focus on the mountain of paperwork in front of him, but his mind kept drifting back to the bus station. The incident had left a bad taste in his mouth, not because it was the first time something like this had happened, but because of how routine it felt. He had spent years in law enforcement, working hard to climb the ranks, proving himself again and again. But moments like yesterday reminded him that no matter how far he had come, he couldn't escape the judgments people made about him based on the color of his skin. His badge had protected him, but it hadn't protected him from Karen's initial assumption that he was a threat. After a few hours, James decided to step away from his desk and get some fresh air. As he walked through the city streets, he couldn't help but think about all the people who didn't have an FBI badge to shield them in situations like that. What if it had been someone else at the station that day? Someone without the authority that came with being an agent. James had seen too many cases of people being profiled, of innocent men and women being arrested or worse, just because they looked suspicious. He had always been aware of the biases in law enforcement, and while he had worked tirelessly to be a force for good, he knew that systemic issues ran deep. When James returned to the office, he sat down at his desk, his thoughts racing. He needed to do something more. Maybe the bus station incident could serve as a catalyst for change. It had gone viral, and while part of him hated that the situation had become public, another part of him realized that it presented an opportunity. That evening, James made a few phone calls, reaching out to colleagues who specialized in community outreach and anti-bias training. He had always believed in the power of education, and now seemed like the perfect time to push for change within law enforcement. He knew he couldn't change people's prejudices overnight, but maybe, with the right approach, he could start a conversation that would make a difference. Back in her quiet suburban home, Karen stared at the viral video for what felt like hours. She knew her life had changed in an instant. People online were calling her a racist, and though she wanted to deny it, a part of her had to admit that she had acted out of a deep-seated bias she hadn't been aware of. The elderly woman's words from the bus station echoed in her mind. It's what you do afterward that matters. Karen knew she couldn't run from this. She had to face it head-on. It wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in her life, she understood that her actions had consequences far beyond her own embarrassment. She had caused real harm, and it was time to figure out how to make it right. Karen sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. The world outside her window carried on as usual, but for her, everything had changed. The weight of the past few days had left her in a state of emotional exhaustion. She had never been one to reflect deeply on her actions, but now, reflection was unavoidable. The viral video of her accusing James at the bus station had spread across every social media platform, accompanied by heated discussions about racial bias, privilege, and the dangers of quick judgment. Her phone, still buzzing with messages and notifications, felt like a ticking time bomb in her pocket. Friends and family were either concerned or shocked, and in some cases, outright angry. Some had sent messages of support, though Karen sensed that most of those came from people who didn't fully understand the gravity of what had happened. Others had bluntly criticized her, accusing her of racism, ignorance, and much worse. For the first time in her life, Karen was forced to face the uncomfortable truth about herself. She had always believed she was one of the good ones, someone who treated everyone fairly, someone who didn't judge people by their appearance. But the bus station incident had shattered that illusion. She had reacted out of fear based not on facts, but on her own unconscious biases. It was a hard pill to swallow, but she knew there was no going back now. The elderly woman's words played over and over in her mind. It's what you do afterward that matters. Karen had no idea where to begin. She had wrongfully accused a man, humiliated herself in front of countless strangers, and now her name was being dragged across the internet. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about the public shame. It was about the damage she had caused to James and to every person like him, who had to navigate a world filled with people making snap judgments based on skin color. She had to do something. Meanwhile, James had spent the days since the bus station incident reflecting in his own way. He was used to being profiled. It had been happening to him for as long as he could remember. But this time, it had sparked something deeper inside him. The experience, while frustrating and exhausting, had provided a platform, albeit unintentional, to address something much bigger than himself. The video had put James in the spotlight, but not as a victim. Rather, it gave him the opportunity to speak about the larger issue of racial bias in law enforcement and society at large. And though he hadn't sought the attention, he knew he could use it for good. At his FBI office, James spent his break scrolling through the comments on the viral video. It was a mix of outrage, sympathy, and attempts at humor, but most importantly, it had ignited an important conversation about the everyday realities black men like him face. People were discussing racial profiling in ways he hadn't seen before, and James saw this as a chance to push for change. After discussing the idea with his colleagues, James took a step he had been considering for a while, organizing a community outreach program that would bring together law enforcement, activists, and everyday citizens to address the very issues that had plagued him for years. He envisioned workshops on implicit bias, open forums where people could share their experiences, and a focus on education to prevent incidents like what had happened at the bus station from occurring in the future. James wasn't naive. He knew that changing deeply ingrained societal biases would be a long, uphill battle. But he also believed in the power of conversation and education. His experience as an FBI agent had shown him that while systems were flawed, they could also be changed. The viral video had given him a platform, and he intended to use it for something positive. Several days later, Karen found herself sitting at her desk, staring at an email draft she had been writing for hours. She had decided to reach out to James, not to defend herself, but to apologize. She knew her apology wouldn't undo what had happened, but it was a first step. After what felt like an eternity of rewriting the same sentence, she finally hit send. Her message was simple. James, I'm writing this to apologize for my actions at the bus station last week. I acted out of fear and ignorance, and I understand now that my assumptions were based on deeply ingrained biases I didn't even realize I had. I know my actions could have caused much more harm than they did, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know that this experience has made me reflect on my behavior and my own biases. I'm committed to educating myself and doing better. I hope you can accept this apology. Sincerely, Karen Simmons. Karen sat back, her heart racing. She had no idea how James would respond, if he even would. She felt exposed, vulnerable, but she knew this was the right thing to do. She couldn't erase what had happened, but she could take responsibility for it. James received the email later that evening. He read Karen's words slowly, thoughtfully, allowing himself to fully absorb the sincerity behind her apology. Over the years, James had encountered people who had made biased assumptions about him, but rarely had any of them ever acknowledged their mistakes, let alone reached out to apologize. Karen's message struck a chord with him. It was clear she was grappling with the consequences of her actions, and while her apology wouldn't undo the harm, it was a step in the right direction. James knew that part of breaking down systemic bias required difficult conversations, and this was one of them. He typed out a brief, but meaningful response. Karen, thank you for your apology. I appreciate that you're taking the time to reflect on what happened. It's important to acknowledge our mistakes and learn from them. This experience could have ended very differently, but I'm glad it's opened your eyes to the biases we all need to confront in our society. If you're truly committed to learning and growing from this, I encourage you to take this as an opportunity to educate others as well. It's the only way we'll create real change. Best. James Carter. James hit send, feeling a sense of closure. He knew Karen's journey toward understanding was just beginning, but he hoped his response would encourage her to move forward with genuine intent to change. In the weeks that followed, Karen did just that. She began attending anti-bias workshops and reading about racial prejudice. She watched documentaries, joined discussions, and made an effort to listen to voices she had once ignored. It wasn't an easy path, and it didn't erase the guilt she felt, but it was a step toward being better. She realized that the real work wasn't about absolving herself, but about helping others understand the importance of confronting their own biases. Meanwhile, James's outreach program gained traction. What had started as a conversation about bias in policing had grown into something much larger. People from all walks of life were joining in, eager to learn and be part of the solution. The bus station incident had been a moment of tension and fear, but in the end, it had sparked a much-needed dialogue about how we see and treat each other. For James, Karen, and the countless others involved, it became a reminder that change, while difficult, was always possible if we were willing to face uncomfortable truths. In the end, the lesson was clear: it's what we do afterward that matters. Did you enjoy this story? Don't stop now. Click on the video to watch the next one. Thanks for your support, and please share your feedback with us.